Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyi'ati a'malina. Man yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlilhu fala hadiya lahu. Wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah wa nashhadu anna sayyidana Mawlana Muhammadan 'abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu ta'ala alihi wa ashabihi wa sallam tasliman kathiran kathira. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to our webinar on Zakat and its contemporary issues and all the wonderful kind of discussions we want to have regarding how Zakat should be employed in today's time, and some of the issues of Ijtihad which relate to Zakat and how people have discussed Zakat in terms of how we incorporate it in sort of contemporary times. So with us, we have two very special guests. They are both familiar faces. I think Mufti Zubair sat in the dark there. We can just about see your face, I think. Maybe the lighting's not very good considering you sat in front of the sun. But most of you are very familiar with Mufti Zubair. He's one of the instructors of Balagh Academy, and he's also the chair of Al-Qalam, which is a scholarly organization that consults and does a lot of research on issues related to Islamic finance. We also have Mufti Amjad, who leads the iftar of Wifaq al-Ulama, and he, again, a very familiar face, another instructor on Al-Balagh Academy as well, and he's contributed in many sessions on Al-Balagh, and as well as our previous webinars as well. So alhamdulillah, this is an excellent opportunity to talk to two people who've worked very intensively on the issue of Zakat and have been challenged and asked many questions from many different organizations and play very important roles in terms of consulting individuals regarding how Zakat should be employed in today's interesting society. So before I begin, I'm just going to outline the importance of Zakat and recognize that Zakat is something that is huge as a subject. Our focus today is not going to be on the basics. For those of you who come just to learn the basics, then we have a separate course on Zakat, and we have instructors who are teaching that. So they'll go to all the different issues related to Nisab, the minimum amount that's required for you to qualify as giving Zakat. Also issues related to distribution and how you work out your Zakat and various other things. But today's discussion is going to be a bit more challenging. Okay, so it's going to be a bit more about contentious issues and also how we employ Zakat more so in the kind of world that we're living in, which is in many ways different to what the world was many years ago. So on the basis of that, there's a couple of things that we want to sort of reiterate in this kind of discussion. So let me first begin by an interesting question. I'll bring this to Mufti Amjad first. And, you know, people do talk about Zakat like it's a tax. Now, before I bring you on board, you know, we recognize that Zakat is a form of purification. Zakat actually means to purify, and it also means, you know, increase, for example, increase in your wealth, profit, etc. So on the basis of that, how would you address this question if somebody's saying, well, Zakat is something that, you know, we're obliged, we should give aqim as-salah wa atu zakat, give Zakat, you know, this is an obligation for us, we should give Zakat, and it's a way of recognizing that it purifies my wealth. But so it's just like a tax, isn't it? We're taxed 2.5% of our sort of profit earning and our assets. So we should treat it just like a tax system. Is it any different?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I can understand where the analogy of it considered as a tax comes from, in the sense that the state gets involved, or the Sharia state gets involved, and it collects it from the citizens. I know I'm using modern terms. It's collected from the citizens, and then it's used for the betterment of what would be state responsibilities. For example, looking after the vulnerable, looking after the weak. And you couldn't, you know, we see it now in modern world, modern society. You reach a certain, you know, and I'll keep analogizing. You reach a certain level, you know, HMRC will say if you're a married man, 12,500, whatever it is, and then that's tax free. So let's just use the word nisab for that. And once you've got beyond that, then you're going to start to get taxed. I guess the only difference is you're getting taxed on earnings rather than getting taxed on savings. But then there's, corporation tax if you're a business, then there's capital gains tax, there's also, inheritance tax. So you can see that where that phrase comes from. And tax is to give something without necessarily you willing to give it. And again, that seems to also fit in with the Shari'i model, that when you have a state and it has a state leader and the amilin are sent out to collect zakat, and you cannot hide the zakat and they will actually take it from you. So you can understand why that analogy exists. So I understand that. However, that's come about because of we sort of strip away the spiritual aspects and the ritual aspects of zakat, and we just see it, in everything. Unfortunately, we see things in a worldly way, and we, understand things in a very zahiri way. So that's where folk get that sort of understanding from. Zakat, obviously, as you mentioned, is something much greater than that. And I think also what we find, particularly in the charity sector, is that zakat tends to be very much recipient focused, as in, you can give it to X, you can give it to Y, you can give it to Z, but you can't give it to A. We forget that zakat is actually primarily the giver focused. Okay, it's actually focused on the giver. The many ayats you will see, very rarely, bar one or two, will speak about the recipients. In fact, it's always addressed at the giver, and it's an act, it's considered as an act of worship. And in fact, we saw very early on when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, left the surface of the earth, we saw that there were renegades that refused to give zakat, and they use a similar sort of term of separating state from the sansokrant, the religious, and the secular from the religious sort of areas. And they would say, we pray to Allah, Allah is living, He is al-Hayy, al-Qayyum, we'll continue to pray to Allah, but we used to give zakat to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is no longer with us, so now we're going to refuse to give zakat. And he was saying Abu Bakr, who quite, surprisingly, but, leadership, brings certain characteristics out of men. It was him who stood up to it and said that I won't tolerate that. And yet, surprisingly, saying Umar was saying, no, how can you go against when you hear people say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. But anyway, cutting a long story short, that refusal of zakat is something which was very early on. And it's a concept which unfortunately will still exist and still exists, because it's always about people not willing to give it. And, just on a terminology point, we always say that, I've paid my zakat. And I know I get sometimes caught up on just little phrases, but I think it's a very important language. And I always say, don't say I've paid zakat, say I've offered zakat. Because, when we pray salah, we offer salah. You don't know if your salah is accepted. You will only know if your salah is accepted on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Similarly, zakat is an ibadah. You're offering your zakat to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hoping He will accept, like qurbani, like zakatul fitr and things like that. So terminology is important, and the way that terminology then becomes operative is also important. So I understand.
Zakat is, in essence, is like a ritual, like salah. So, and we should see it like an act of worship. So we have verses of the Quran, خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا. So basically take from their wealth, their sadaqah, and that purifies them in that sense. So remember that people do use this language, and I think it's important for us to understand that for two reasons: for spiritual reasons and also for ahkam reasons as well. Because sometimes people compare zakat with tax, and for that reason they sometimes get a bit muddled up in terms of what zakat should be doing and achieving. So on the basis of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of us to give zakat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of anything. Reality is we're in need of it. So we're in need to give zakat, to purify ourselves, purify our wealth, and actually gain this sense of spiritual element of giving, and not being miserly, and also having this sense of fraternity, recognizing who the people are, and a sense of generosity amongst us. Now, moving on to that, so okay, we recognize that zakat is quite different to tax. It's much more of a ritual. There's a spiritual component to it, as well as one which requires us to give to our community and gives that sense of giving. So when it comes to giving, and we talk about there are certain objectives that zakat is also trying to achieve, and that is to diminish poverty as well as some additional. So Is that the sole objective, Mufti Zubair, of zakat, is to diminish poverty? We know there's verses of the Quran which relate to the people who are sahib zakat, the people who can receive zakat, the recipients. But is there a higher objective in zakat other than to diminish poverty?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الرسل وخاتم النبيين محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for asking me on today to have a chat with yourselves. If you look at the nusus of the Holy Quran and the Sunnah.
By the way, Mufti Sahib, before you answer, this is a loaded question.
I know it's a loaded question, and that's why. If you look at the nusus of the Holy Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you look at the wording, you will find that, for example, in the hadith of Mu'adh radiyallahu ta'ala anhu or Jabir radiyallahu anhu, تؤخذ من أغنيائهم وترد على فقرائهم. So this talks about taking the zakat revenues from the wealthy and giving them to the poor. Equally, when the non-Muslims asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam for some money and to be given money from the zakat revenues, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam received verses of the Holy Quran, إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين, which gave 8 different categories of recipient. And if you look at the categories of recipient, you find there are those people that are perpetually or for the time being there at a moment of need. So you have the faqir, you have miskin, irrespective of what the exact definition is. That is that person who has either nothing or very little. Besides one category, all the categories there they are, in the Hanafi school of understanding at least, they are those people that are essentially poor. So the Islamic exchequer has different different pots with which it spends on its people. And zakat is primarily to uplift the very destitute and give them at least a minimum level of existence, of sustenance. So that's why you find عاملين عليها, beyond عاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم. These, apart from مؤلفة القلوب as well, you have those people غارمين, those people that are under debt. So they are under dire straits themselves. They don't have enough to pay off their debts, and they are fearing the punitive measures of their creditors, and so that is the type of person we have. Then you have someone who is ibn sabil, somebody who is a wayfarer, who has no wealth with him or her, and although they may be wealthy at home, their current situation is such that they are destitute. وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل, and in في سبيل الله say منقطع الغزاة, those that have gone out in the path of Allah to fight and do jihad, and they are now separated. So again, they are at an increased level of want. So وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل, and then also, so the categories of zakat that you have here are people that are very much in need. Okay, and it's about alleviating their need, their immediate need, to allow them to exist in the short term. So that is the initial intent of zakat.
Yeah, so we when we do talk about zakat, sometimes our main reference goes to poverty, doesn't it? It talks about people who are poverty stricken, and hence for that reason zakat in essence is a way of distributing that kind of wealth to them. But reality is, according to the verse that you just mentioned, when we talk about alimina, and also we talked about fi sabilillah, these individuals may actually have anna mu'allafatul qulub, to some degree, may have actually some wealth, but yet they will fall within a particular category of people who are in need, and hence they would qualify with serious conditions. So having recognized that, let's just look at generally the issue of defining poverty. So we have a system in place, don't we, regarding nisab. A nisab is the minimum amount that a person has that would actually require them to qualify for them to actually then having to pay zakatable amounts, in other words, amounts that are profits beyond that, then they would have to then pay up a zakat. Now, we know that nisab is a fixed amount. Maybe for the benefit of our audience, if I can first turn to Mufti Amjad, if you can give us a bit of an insight in terms of nisab. And I want you to do it in a sense that there are some individuals who now talk about this idea of poverty and how poverty varies in different places. So for example, in the UK, in London, we've got extortion prices, you know. So individuals, they can't afford homes, they can't afford, you know, because, and yet nisab is a fixed amount. How do we get around that? How should we take on this idea of nisab? And I recognize that even the other madhahib, they don't necessarily look at nisab, they look at kifaya. So, you know, what suffices, but, you know, various other things around that. So people do use that idea. What are your thoughts regarding that?
With regards to nisab that was set from the Prophet of Allah's time, whether it's when he speaks of gold and silver and the difference of 200 dirham and 20 dinar, because the silver price was approximately 10 times the price of, the gold price was approximately 10 times the price of or value of silver. We now find that that's a huge difference now. In terms of gold's values increased significantly compared to where silver is. So it is not as though Rasulullah had discrimination against individuals who trade in the silver, because what we could easily do then, or what people around the time of the Prophet could do, is just convert all their silver into gold, and they would avoid giving zakat. So, you know, for instance, if you've got silver, you're giving zakat when you've got 360, whatever, 370 pound. But if you've got it in the form of gold, you're not giving it till you've had 3,800 pounds. So that's a significant difference in terms of what determines poverty. And similarly, if you were a farmer, then, you know, depending on what you farmed, you were involved in animal husbandry. So whether you had sheep, whether you had goats, whether you had camels, and I'm sure we all remember all the various musinna and all the other calculations we had to work out, which as yet I've not applied, but I'm sure some of you may have, in terms of, you know, giving certain creatures of a certain age away. So it was meant to be very easy. It was meant to be very simple, in the sense that irrespective of what you traded in, whether you were a tradesman or whether you were involved in the farming industry, because that's really what used to go on. There was hardly much of a service sector as such. It was, you know, you either, you know, did business in gold and silver, or you were involved in animals. So it was set so that the level would be the same, and it was set obviously in the time of the Prophet of Allah's time, and that nisab value has remained. However, with the fact that the gold and silver is significantly different, that gives options for ulama to explore. And whereas a silver nisab might seem adequate, and I know I'm generalizing, in countries which are referred to as developing world, so, you know, whatever, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, where a lot of your viewers or members will be from, that seems understandable. But if you're living in the States, or if you're living in the UK or whatever, you know, do we really consider 380 pound or around that figure to be somebody who we would consider self-sufficient? Because that's the term I like to use for nisab, is that it determines self-sufficiency. As soon as you drop below nisab, you are no longer self-sufficient. You need the state or the apparatus of the state to assist you to live a normal life, or to be able to feed and whatever. So, and I think that's, you know, we just to at least get some ijtihad in there without getting told off, but that's an ijtihadi matter now. And I know colleagues in North America have gone towards gold. I have had communications with ulama in the UK, but there's a little bit of a hesitation in the UK to take that kind of step towards gold. As an individual, in terms of applying it in a few of the charities that, you know, I'm involved in, then that's something we can explore in certain circumstances. And so yes, it is subjective, but it is a value which you know, what was a potentially problem is actually something that can be utilized, this difference in gold and silver, because we don't actually use gold and silver. We're using currency now, and so it's equivalent to that. So it is subjective, but it's also, you need a value there. You know, there's a few, you mentioned kifaya, where, for example, in the Maliki madhab, if I'm not mistaken, you would give sufficient zakat to a person so that it would fulfill their needs, okay, for a year, I think. So, how do you determine fulfill their needs? My necessity might be your haja. Your haja might be my tahsinat. Where do we draw the line? We all live different lifestyles. Somebody might be quite comfortable in a £100 set on £100 settee with a but somebody might fully feel comfortable in £1,000 settee. So how do we now start determining that? And we've had conversations with practitioners of zakat about trying to determine this, and it's not easy because we all live different lifestyles. But this is an area for much research.
Okay, so we're looking at the issue of kifaya and what suffices. So what's your experience regarding this? I'm sure you get approached by a number of different people. What's your take on
Okay.
this issue of poverty and silver and gold and
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, let me take you back to this idea that zakat is to be taken from the wealthy and given to the poor. So the nisab that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, they are a representation of wealth, of what a person is when a person is wealthy. And when it comes to silver, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a Sahih hadith, he said that less than 5 wasaq is there is no sadaqah in less than 5 wasaq. So wasaq, and each one wasaq was 40 dirhams. So that's where we get the 200 dirhams. When it comes to gold, this is also established from hadith, but the hadiths individually are all weak. But collectively, they give strength to one another. And Shaykh 𝐁𝐚 has discussed all of this in Fiqh Zakat. But they do give strength to one another, and more or less by agreement almost. I won't say consensus, by almost agreement that the 20 mithqal is the nisab of gold. Then we go, which is 7.5 tola of gold in the Asian kind of understanding of it. Then when we go into livestock, let's look at what when it comes to camels, how many camels do you have to be before you are considered to be rich? And the nisab for that is 5 camels. So the value of 5 camels, how much is that nowadays, will give you an idea of what was considered to be somebody who is wealthy with regards to when they have ownership of camels. Similarly, cows, buffaloes, and oxen, which were at least 1 year old, you have to have a minimum of 30. So 30 cows, the value of 30 cows, 30 oxen, or 30 buffaloes, or 1 year old at least, what would that be in today's money? And if it was goat and sheep, then that would be 40. Okay, so 40 goats. I mean, if you look at these different nisabs Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam he gave us, then they if you look at the value of all them, is quite significantly different to what the level of nisab of silver is nowadays. Yeah. Okay, so and if you look at the reason the level of nisab of silver has depreciated really or the value of that is depreciated, is that we don't really deal with that anymore, and so the demand for silver has decreased, and so that is quite an anomaly now from both how much it would cost for 5 camels. If you're looking at about £700-800 per camel, that's about £3,500, £4,000, something around that length. Buffaloes, I don't know. Mufti Amjad will probably deal in buffaloes back home. You know the prices of them. I don't know what they are, but a minimum of 30. So it's quite a significant number before a person is declared to be poor.
Significant in terms of the differences between them.
Yeah, there's also difference in between them as well. And then 40 goats and sheep about £100. The 40s, that's about £4,000.
How do we get around this, Mufti Sahib? You're going to give us a whole list of all these.
Okay, so I'm trying to give you an understanding of what was a person was considered to be wealthy, right? If we take the value of silver to the further we sort of depreciate it. If the value of silver becomes, I don't know, worth of £10 and now the nisab of silver becomes worth £10, are we still going to stick the nisab of silver? That for me the question is, okay, when do we depart from the nisab of silver? Right. Now if somebody has only silver, then you use the nisab of silver. That's undisputed. But if somebody has gold or has other than gold and silver on which zakat is payable, they have stock, they have sales stock, they buy and sell on eBay or whatever. Now, should you value that according to silver, or should you value that according to gold? Or should you value that according to animals, or should you value that according to buffalo or whatever? Which nisab should you use to actually value that? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam hasn't fixed any particular one, neither gold, nor silver, nor buffalo, and etc. And the fuqaha, they have adopted gold and silver. Why? Primarily because this is what you bought the buffaloes for. This is what you bought, or the trade stock you bought for. You bought it with gold and silver. So that it was a natural kind of a sort of a measure for wealth. And the original position in the Hanafi school of Imam Hanifa rahmatullah alayh is the person is has the choice to choose either silver or gold. Whereas Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, Imam Muhammad rahimahullah says what is dominant in the city, they use that. If it's gold, that's gold. If it's silver, it's silver. And Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah has slightly a different position from that. So it's not, certain narration from Imam Hanifa rahimahullah say where there is a discrepancy, then you use that what is beneficial to the poor. Now, we as in Hanafi school have adopted this anfa' lil fuqara idea, what is beneficial to the poor, in the sense that the recipient of zakat, what gives him or her zakat quicker, because we levy zakat on a wealthy person much quicker, and they receive zakat a lot quicker. That is the idea we have seen as anfa' lil fuqara.
Okay.
For me, the case today is actually the person that you are required to give zakat based on the silver nisab. Do you actually consider that person in the grand scheme of things to be actually rich, which Mufti Amjad has alluded to already? And in this day and age, particularly if you add the cost of living in London or in other major cities in the West, then nobody considers that person to be poor. In fact, that person with that level of zakat nisab may not even be able to make do for the week. So how can somebody who would become eligible to receive zakat within a week be considered to be rich? For me, that the discrepancy is so great now that we have to move away from this idea of what is anfa' lil fuqara and use silver. For me, this person is faqir. And it's more detriment to this faqir that we ask him to give zakat as well. He can't pay his week's rent, he can't pay for his food and travel, etc. Forget clothing and anything else, and yet we are asking him to give zakat. You are liable to give zakat. For me, this poor faqir is being further disadvantaged. So my sort of current leaning.
So could you not argue the case there and say that an individual like that, they clearly have debts in terms of they have to pay up their bills, they have to pay their rent, so they don't there's nothing to pay zakat on because they don't have zakatable amount anyway.
But if they have, for example, £370, and the debt and the debt is not due right today, for example, 370, and the debt is not due today, then you can't mind it. Yeah. So for me, I think we need to be a bit more bold.
Okay.
And to be honest, even in Mufti Amjad mentioned that maybe developing countries, even in the developing countries now, the ulama are starting to at least change their stance with regards to qurbani. Because sometimes what happens, if a person he is required to give qurbani, then he very nextly he's the one that is sacrificed himself, because it cost all his money goes into just buying the animal. And so therefore they recognize this conundrum with regards to qurbani. But for me, especially in the West, this needs to be extended further, and it is not mansus, it is not declared by nas of the Quran or Sunnah that we have to use the silver nisab, which you use it on the basis of ijtihad. And so for me, that has to change now.
Okay, inshallah. Just for the benefit of the audience, there's a couple of technical terms that I've used there. If anybody does need clarification, I'll try to clarify some of those words as we go along, and so will our guests as well, inshallah. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple of other questions which are really important, especially on the issue of zakat and how we employ zakat in today's time. So I will ask those questions, but audience, you have the opportunity to ask questions as well, so you can use Q&A. Please use Q&A, don't use chat. Use Q&A, and then inshallah we'll go through Q&A, and I'll sort of put forward some of those questions that I think would be appropriate for this session, inshallah. I'm going to move on to something again, which is quite important, and we recognize its importance. And we recognize about early Islam, we know that there was a centralizing body. So there was Bayt al-Mal, there was, and it was established by the government. Okay, so there was a sense of wilaya. Okay, in this sense. So we would have zakat that would come to this central place, and then there it would be distributed according to the needy. Is there scope for this in today's time? And I'm asking this in a very broad way. I'm not going down to the specifics because it can be quite detailed, and I don't want detail too much for the benefit of the audience as well. Just get straight to the point. Is there scope for this in the kind of society that we live today, in terms of, because here, us living as minority Muslims in the UK, for example, or even America and Europe, most of our audience are from these kind of countries. We don't have a centralizing government that can distribute zakat, because our government, it works quite differently, and it's a non-Muslim government. So is there scope for an organization, for example, to play a role like this potentially? Mufti Amjad, any thoughts regarding that? And you don't have to be direct in your response. Just talk around it, maybe.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I wasn't sure whether Mufti Zubair said we need to be gold or we need to be bold. But anyway, or was he saying both? I don't know.
You need to be bold and use gold.
You see, he's already got the motto ready, mashallah. I think just to add to what Mufti Zubair said was about the nisab, is that, remember, there's also the second nisab of me being a recipient of zakat, that even if I don't have nami, even if I've got, furniture in my house or whatever, and if it reaches a certain amount, I can no longer be a recipient of zakat, even though I'm in a very difficult situation. Returning to your point about, what do we do as a minority, then we do have precedents within our books of fiqh which speak about, ulama taking responsibility. And alhamdulillah, we've seen that, in its higgledy-piggledy way. And I'm not going to open the can of worms of what time we should pray salah and which particular moon we should follow. But you've already seen that we have organizations, whether it's Jamiat Ulama, whatever it's been over the decades that we've been in this country, where ulama have come together to try to resolve the key issues which impacts us on a day-to-day basis. The time we pray, when we should fast, obviously Hajj is out of our hands anyway, and obviously the issue of zakat. And we've seen charities develop that particular area to ensure that there is zakat is being collated, and then zakat is being spent as well. And this extends to zakatul fitr, it extends then to qurbani. And so we have that. And we live in a society where there's no authority. That is very difficult, unless obviously the authority is established by intelligence and reputation, for one body to possibly represent that, because we are a factitious group of people, mashallah. Even when there's two of us, there's already two sects there. So we're that nature of creature, aren't we, unfortunately? And therefore, one organization, one group may not necessarily fit everybody's agenda. So there's space for numerous organizations. However, having said that, it's very important, and I'm sure you'll be leading on to this later as well, Dr. Saab, is about the fact that these organizations that do stand up to represent us, that they actually stand the test of authenticity, reputation, and obviously transparency, and ensuring they're doing right. So yes, organizations should come up, but they shouldn't just be a free market, basically, to do what we like, as we like, because, how we define zakat, how we define halal, if I go into the kind of a consumer industry, how we define halal, these are very loose definitions. And until they're nailed down and actually, policyfied, and then, ensure that there's some level of accountability, then there can be problems. So that hopefully is a summarized version of the answer.
Inshallah. So there's discourse regarding centralized zakat, in the sense that these organizations to play an important role. In another way, that if we are centralizing, are we looking at centralizing nationally? Are we looking at centralizing locally? Because there is question of localizing it. So precedence is given to your locality first. So, it's in our nature, especially in the UK and America, places like that, we give a lot of our zakat abroad. Is there an obligation I mean, people talk about obligations about giving locally first, or even giving it to relatives, even within those who are local. Mufti Zubair, what's the discourse regarding this in terms of, you know, the importance of locality? You know, are we expected to give our local? And we are clearly now, you know, you don't have to go very far. You just need to go to the local supermarket and you see people begging out there, you know. So do we have an obligation to give to them before we give to people who are poor abroad? And this, to most people, this may seem like a simple response. Why should we restrict it locally? But there is quite a lot of discourse about this, isn't it, in terms of obligations about giving it locally as well. So, Zubair, what are your thoughts regarding that in terms of?
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The first priority is to give to the most needy. Okay. And if the most needy can include relatives as well, then there's a double reward for that. And after that, it is about giving locally. And locally would be where the wealth is. Okay. So it's not a black and white, it's not absolute yes and no. And in the Hanafi school, it's not a requirement. It's highly recommended. It is you know, encouraged. But if a person was to give beyond the locality, then that would also be valid. And when people do give beyond the locality, it tends to be for a reason. For example, if we are, so up until now we've been giving most of our zakat abroad, we have been doing it because we have seen the people there are possibly at a heightened need. They have nothing. They don't have two pennies to smash together. They don't have a roof over their heads, and so we are pulled by that. Or it may be because we have relatives back home, etc., who we know are needy, and rather than help them in any other way, it is quite convenient to help them through our zakat. So there will be reasons why a person departs from the locality. And so it's not that this idea that, okay, you know, I think the emphasis on local has to be balanced. It shouldn't be a case that is to the detriment of everything else, and the focus is so strong that it would seem to suggest that zakat isn't valid until done locally, and then unless it's given to our organization. And once it comes to unless given to our organization, then that's not locally anyway. That's nationally, it's not locally. Locally would be the area where the zakat wealth exists. Give it to the poor of that area. Yes, we should be at least moving to alleviate some of that poverty around us at least. And so, in short, is the most needy first. Then, if they are relatives, then okay, that's a double reward, and then locally. But it's not hard and fast.
Okay, right. So basically, the idea is that this is the approach that we should take, but it's not an obligation to do it that way. Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot of questions on this subject, and in full honesty, we're not going to get the time to do all to go through a lot of this, because you know they just you ask one question, there's about 10 that come from that. I'm going to just talk a bit more about the idea about distribution. So how we distribute zakat. So on the basis of distribution, we have, you know, like the verse that was mentioned earlier on, مُعَلَّفَ قُلُوبٍ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ عَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا. These are the sort of groups of people who are basically being stipulated in the verse of the Quran, who are those who can receive zakat. Now, they're open to interpretation, and you'll see that there's been a lot of discourse even amongst the fuqaha regarding what that refers to. Let me start with Mufti Zubair first. So mu'allaf al-qulub, those people who we're trying to soften their heart towards our faith, our deen. And there are many different categories. Well, there's a few broad categories that most of the fuqaha talk about that would fall within that scope. Now, we're talking about this being, I'm going to get just a bit technical, not too technical, and I'm saying this to our audience, in the sense that has this been abrogated? You know, these individuals, has it been abrogated? So in other words, if it's been abrogated, we can't use that anymore. These people cannot receive zakat. Yeah. Or the other issue is there a illah? Is there an effective cause that existed at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even earlier Sahaba radiyallahu anhum, Khulafa Rashidun, and now that effective cause no longer remains, because Islam is quite big. It's quite systematic. It is it's quite organized, and we don't need to make people in effect come towards our deen in this sense, and therefore we sort of give zakat to them to soften their hearts. What is Zubair? So from that perspective, people are now using this and saying that we can go back to this using this illah or effective cause to actually now instill this idea that there are people who will fall within this category. What are your thoughts regarding that?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, in the Hanafi school and the Maliki school, they consider this particular category to have been abrogated. The Hanbali school and the Shafi school, they consider it to have been suspended, and if the same illah, if the same reasons was the same situation was to exist again, then it could be continued.
So that's the
Now,
general opinion of the madhab. I know there's differences amongst scholars with each one of those.
Yeah, there's a huge discussion, but that's the general position of the madhab. Now, in the Hanafi school, they refer to the statement of Umar radiallahu anhu when non-Muslims came to him, and this was during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, and asked him for for some money from the zakat revenues. Previously had asked Abu Bakr, and Abu Bakr had given it to them. And then when they came to Umar radiallahu ta'ala, he refused to give it to them, and he said, look, this was something we used to do in the past, and now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has strengthened Islam, given izzah to Islam. You can either choose to believe or you can choose not to believe. Okay, and so he refused, and so they went to complain to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and said, are you the Khalifa or is he? He's not giving us the zakat money. And so Abu Bakr said, if he wants, he's a Khalifa. So even he didn't go against what Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, what Umar decided, and this is said to have happened in the midst of the Sahaba. So it's considered, and nobody objected, so it's considered to be kind of ijma sakuti. So this is the basis of, and so what they say is that this has abrogated, some have said that this abrogated the hukum. But this, technically, there's an issue here. How can the practice or the action of a Sahabi abrogate something after the demise of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So therefore the Hanafi school have sort of done a lot of, discussion on this and try to somehow say, okay, they have different ways that the illah no longer exists, or the extent of the hukum was until a certain period, and that has ceased. In all truth, though, to argue that it's abrogated is quite difficult to argue, and for me, the Hanafi school hasn't really made that case. Okay, I haven't seen it from the Maliki, but from the Hanafi school, at least, I don't think they have really made that case. So it can be said that this actually does continue. Mu'allafatul qulub does continue. Now, there's another discussion as who are Mu'allafatul qulub? Does that include non-Muslims or only Muslims? So amongst the Shafi school, which says Mu'allafatul qulub it still continues. They say this is restricted to Muslims only, not non-Muslims. Okay, it is the Hanafi school who say that actually it includes non-Muslims but it's abrogated. Okay, and so there's a bit of discussion here about whether it includes Muslims or non-Muslims. However, Imam Qurtubi and others have also enumerated those people that were given as mu'allafat al-qulub, they were given zakat revenues, and they all, when they counted them all out, they all tended to be Muslim, and none of them were non-Muslims. And so Imam Qurtubi says that the conclusion of this is that when zakat revenues were given to mu'allafat al-qulub, they were only Muslim and not Muslim. And in the Hanafi school, when I look at the books of the Hanafi school, when they talk about giving it to non-Muslims, quite strangely, for some reason, when the example they give or the reference they give reference to wabuti and not zakat revenues. And so it seems to be quite convoluted, or quite confused. And possibly the reason for that confusion is that after the time of Umar, it was never really practiced. And so it just was left as a theory, and just people theorized this. But when they gave the examples, and I was quite surprised at this, they gave an example of fay of what they call it, of booty, of ghanima, as opposed to zakat revenue. The argument is about zakat revenues, and the example is about ghanima. So for me, this is a very problematic area of extending this to those who are not, not Muslim. And even then there's a discussion. Are you giving them the zakat funds to strengthen Islam, or are you giving it for them to enter Islam? Is it for their benefit, or is it for the benefit of Islam as an institution? And some have argued it's for their benefit, some have argued it's for the institution. For me, there is scope here. There is possibly scope here, but it needs to be argued coherently. And it needs to be in the very limited sort of application that it had, not just generalizing. And so, because some of the fuqaha that mentioned, you give it only to the non-Muslim when they're about to attack you, and if you don't give it to them, that you won't be able to appease them, as opposed to, it's just less general, sort of outreach work, etc. Trying to, that doesn't qualify under the Mu'allafat al-Qulub understanding that the fuqaha of the past have discussed.
We can't give it to right-wing organizations, then, yeah.
Yeah, it's when the threat is imminent. Those that have allowed its threat is imminent from that person, and if you don't give it, then you already a threat of coming to harm. So that's where it applies. And whereas we try to sort of give it a new ijtihad and give it widen the scope, and anything and everything more or less becomes eligible to receive this, and for me that is problematic.
Yeah. So because so basically the conditions need to be very clearly identified and strictly adhered to. Yeah. And sometimes we can appeal to the idea of maslaha, can't we, and sort of limit, and then we're all over the place. Okay, so right, let's move on, because like I said, we've got quite a few questions that I need to sort of address in the Q&A as well. Mufti Amjad, yes, okay. Amilina alayha, those people who basically distribute the money for us, yeah? Are they, the issue regarding them, now this is now broadening to who falls within that condition. So let's say charity organizations. Are they people who can receive zakat?
Bismillah. One of the things I think that needs to be said is the interpretations which exist within the various madhahib. Where we have, alhamdulillah, within the Hanafi madhab, a system in place, and we know that the majority of Muslims in the UK, whether nominally or practically, follow the Hanafi school of law. And there's quite clear criteria for that. When sort of I got more involved in the sort of zakat sector, and you come across many people of different madhahib, and even those who don't practice a madhab, and you see how their methodology and their practices are utilized. And when you're in the process of either writing policies, and I'm sure Mufti Zubair Saab's got plenty of experience in this as well, when you're in the process of writing policies and you want to make them inclusive, because what you don't want to do is make them exclusive, and it's how you make them inclusive, and whilst maintaining some level of what's the word, soundness in the madhab you're adopting. Sorry?
Authenticity.
Yeah, authenticity. Thank you. Yeah. So you got, it's how you keep that inclusiveness and authenticity. So it's not an easy task. I want to say that on the outset. It's not an easy task, and it's a task which is quite burdensome, and it can be very challenging. It's easy when you're sat in your Hanafi bubble, mashallah, and you can say what you like. But when you go out in the bigger, wider world, it has its challenges. Anyway, I just wanted to sort of put that out there so people know, those of us who operate in that world, what we have to operate.
It's quite an important point, though, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
Sometimes people don't really appreciate that. Yeah, no. One example of that is when somebody complains about people who are in politics, and they'll get all sorts of accusations thrown at them. But reality is, when you're in politics yourself, you see the level of burden that it is to maintain an upright approach, and so yeah, clearly this is something quite important to understand. Yeah,
it is, and there are circles who are in closed environments that will call out individuals who are trying to operate in this way that I'm describing to you, and you can call it the burden of leadership, you can call it the isolated world, the lonely world of leadership, and it
diversity, even a serious diversity. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah, it has, you know, it's burdensome. I think people think it's quite, you know, it's a nice place to be, but it genuinely isn't. You know, it's the kind of hadith which mentions being slaughtering with a blunt knife. But anyway, that aside, so the amilina alayha is open to interpretation. Some will accept the zakat collectors to be amilina alayha because they take it in the very broadest understanding, and they say, well, that's exactly what these zakat agents are doing. These grant officers, these case workers, they are just doing that. Their full-time job is literally to collect zakat and to then ensure it is delivered appropriately. However, in certain madhahib, this is in a position where you are in a position of authority, where you can actually take the zakat, and charities are not in a position where they can take zakat. We actually go to charities and give our zakat. So really that's a big difference, and there's more of a wakala there than amilina alayha. So that's so you know, so that needs to be understood of how they differ and why they differ. But I think it's very important that when we're moving forward and we're working with these diverse communities, that it's done in such a way to incorporate these differences, but at the same time, like Mufti said, you know, that authenticity has to be there, that you're not on that ship and you're not on that ship and you're not on that ship, you know, you're not here there. So that's my response to that.
Okay, inshallah. Musab, this is a much broader one, I think. Anyway, fi sabilillah, the people who are in the path of Allah. So we are these people. Are we talking about people who are doing jihad? You know, jihad. Then we got all these definitions of jihad. People who are on the battlefield, physically fighting in the path of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. These are the only people who can receive zakat. Is that what the verse is identifying? Is that what the fuqaha are telling us, that it can only be them? And you explained this before, that these are individuals who clearly they have the blocking of the means to their wealth. So for that reason, because they're in the path of jihad. Or does this extend a bit further than that? Because there is some discourse by some fuqaha about it extends a bit beyond that. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, okay. First of all, let's look at this verse in the Holy Quran. Innama sadaqatu lil fuqara. Right? The innama in the Arabic language, it reduces the scope. It gives you exclusivity. Innama, and then what's introduced after that says, okay, this is restricted. So we have to understand that this verse is introduced by the word innama, which means that what comes afterward, the 8 categories that come afterward, there is some restriction in there. Now, fi sabilillah, the word fi sabilillah has a general application, you know, in its meaning, and can mean anything that is done to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is all in the fi sabilillah. And then if we say that, then the innama becomes obsolete. The restriction and the exclusivity introduced by innama is actually, if we say fi sabilillah, every good deed is fi sabilillah, then that becomes obsolete. When you look at the discussion of the fuqaha and those people that understood, and the mufassirin, etc., who understood these verses, understood the, you know, the circumstances of revelation, etc., exact the nuances around in these, you know, these verses, they said one munqati'ul ghuzat, those people out in jihad who are not just anybody going in jihad, but now that have been separated and from the rest of the army, and you know, so at a moment of need. Others said, okay, those that are going for Hajj, and they may have 1 or 2 others, but generally this was restricted to a very small number of individuals. 3, 4 maybe different categories that fall under this idea of fi sabilillah. It wasn't the idea that actually this applies to every good deed, everything that promotes Islam, everything that's good for the Muslims. It wasn't like that. It was the understanding of the previous fuqaha. So now I think we have to maintain that understanding of the unrestrictedness. Otherwise, we lose actually the flavor of the verse. Innama becomes obsolete then. So yes, there are a few more, but it's not an open book to, you know, include anything and everything.
Okay.
I think the problem we have is we look at all our expenditure through the lens of zakat. We don't look that there are actually other avenues of funding as well, which used to take care of all these other areas, which we no longer have. And so now we all want to shove it down the throat of zakat and say, okay, everything has to come out here. And that, I think, is to our detriment.
Okay, inshallah. Now I'm going to just throw some questions at both of you. And hopefully simple responses, quick answers, and I'll try to make the questions short. If you are asking questions, please make it short, no longer than 3 lines. Otherwise, I'm not going to read it. So we've got a limited time, so we'll try to get through as many questions as we can, inshallah. So Mufti Amjad, zakat. Okay, when we give zakat and the shart, we can't put shart, we can't put condition on it. Look, I'm going to give you zakat only if you do this with this money, or only if you do that. There's a question here. Can we ask that person, please, you have to, I'll give you this money only, or zakat only if you make dua for me? Is that a condition you can put on somebody?
No, you cannot put that condition. Absolute tamlik tam has to take place where the person has absolute authority over the wealth with no association.
Tamlik is ownership, just for the
complete ownership where there are no conditions or indiscretions or whatever allowed with it. So no, you cannot do that.
Okay, Mufti Amjad, this is an interesting one, and this is posed by Mufti Abdul Wahid, and this is about the issue related to committees. I think they use different terms in different places, but I'm very accustomed to the word committee, but he's actually used that word. We spelled it in a very funny way, KEMETTY. But anyway, people have this system in place where
he's expressed
amount. Sorry,
he's expressed it in Urdu.
Committee, yeah, you have to say it with the accent. Yeah. But anyway, so the idea is that you have a group of people and they all put in a certain small amount on a gradual basis, on a monthly basis, and they all put all this fund together. And over time, what will happen is this amount will increase. But what happens is the total amount for that month is given to individuals who are part of this membership. Okay. So that's the general gist of it. And I'm sure most people are familiar with this system that is being used quite extensively in many different places. What are your thoughts regarding committee and how it works in terms of zakat?
Well, zakat is obviously due upon it. It's an investment. If the only issue comes up about accessibility, then obviously in that regard, it's clear that accessibility may not be there immediately, but if he was to ask for it, he would get access to it. So therefore, zakat is due upon it, and the nisab would be there, and the lunar calendar, once it would pass, he would add it to the other assets and give zakat accordingly.
Okay. So in essence, because I suppose the idea there is that you're giving a small amount, gradually building up over time, and then let's say you're the last one to receive it, then, so we just apply the same rulings of zakat as they were, depending on how much amount you have in that time. So would it be considered as just lending somebody money? Is that how it's seen?
I don't think it's lending. Mufti Zubair might know them more. I don't use committees. I'm, modern English, but I use the
Maybe you should.
Or the mattress.
Mufti Zubair.
Zubair seems to be more acquainted with the committees.
Mufti Amjad is a renegade of his community, and that's why he's not part of a committee, right? Yeah. I don't have enough relatives to be involved in the committee, but I do understand the concept. It's a mutual borrowing and lending thing. It's a mutual borrowing and lending kind of structure, and whether you pay zakat on it depends on where you are in the borrowing and lending kind of sequence. So, for example, somebody, they receive zakat, the committee runs on, for example, 2 years, and they've already received their full amount. So it's for £10,000 something, and they've received £10,000. So effectively what they have done, they have borrowed £10,000 from everyone else, and they are now have a debt on them. So they don't pay for that £10,000 because that is a debt that they owe a debt to other people, and so therefore there will be no zakat on that individual. However, if they have contributed for a year, for example, they have put £5,000 in. So effectively, they have lent money, £5,000 to other people. So that is zakat. The £5,000 that they have put into that is zakatable for them.
Yeah. Okay.
Somebody has took the first they got the first sort of amount on the first turn. And then they paid zakat. They paid money in for 1 year, so they paid back 5,000, and they have 5,000 outstanding, which they have to still pay into the pot. Then they don't pay zakat. They'll take, first of all, they will take 5,000 out of the zakatable assets and pay that on the rest. So it depends where you are on the sequence on borrowing. Have you borrowed or have you lent, or have you borrowed? Have you lent out or have you borrowed yourself?
Okay, inshallah. This is an open question. It's been asked by a few people, so I'm going to have to say it, and I don't really know much about it myself. But can you throw light on zakat for 401k?
I think 401k is a pension scheme that works in the state, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Okay. Are any of you familiar with that?
I've not worked with it.
Let's skip that then for the moment, inshallah. So we have one
Well,
from
because if you refer to the likes of Mufti Abdullah Nana in the USA, I think probably the questions have probably come from the US. So if you ask Mufti Abdullah Nana, then I'm sure Al-Balagh can.
Let's talk about that more broadly. Let's take it as, I'm assuming it's a pension scheme or something, yeah. So
yeah, that's what I understand it to be.
In terms of pension, Mufti Zubair, you've done quite a bit of work on this, haven't you?
Okay.
In terms of pensions, make this brief though. In terms of, because I know it's huge, but in terms of pensions, what's the general approach about zakat? When are we eligible to give zakat if we have a pension? What can pensions require us to do that?
Okay, Bismillah. There are two types of pension. One pension you generally find in civil service, which will be a defined income scheme, which basically means that according to a certain calculation, when you retire, you will be given a pension until you don't die, or until your spouse, normally this a beneficiary, etc. So you have no where the pension, what happens to the pension pot is no interest, is not of your interest. It's nothing to do with you. Your employer will simply keep giving you a wage. There is no zakat on that. There is no zakat on the defined income scheme. Where it is defined contribution, you know how much you are going to get put into the pot, and then it is invested on your behalf. So it might be a personal pension or it might be a work pension, but it's known as a defined contribution scheme. That is an investment of yours, in which the investment is done on your behalf. Depending on how that is invested, it will be zakatable. So it can be, if it's, for example, if it's invested in property that is on rent, then the property itself is not zakatable, and there will be a less amount of zakat to pay on there. And if it's in stocks and shares that you are buying and selling, then the full amount will probably be zakatable. So it depends how. Normally you have a mixed portfolio. So a general question is difficult to understand. It has to be a specific question. Yeah. These are my circumstances. What is my zakat liability?
So broadly, there are the two sort of the two types. So NHS pension, that would fall into the first category.
That would fall into the first one. You can rest assured. No zakat for you to pay, inshallah, until you receive.
Okay. We've got a question regarding the local needy poor person before we think of using our zakat abroad. We've already discussed this. So this is something about ideally, work around your local needy people, and that should be given more privilege, but there's no obligation to do that. You can give zakat abroad as well. Abdul Karim Shaykh is asking, when calculating zakat, how does one deal with pension? Oh, we talked about pensions already, so that's done. Taha says, please explain how zakat will be dealt with loans given for business purposes. Mufti Amjad, this is yours. So basically, mortgages in particular, and we have interest-based mortgages. We may have loans which are not interest-based. How does zakat work on that? Let's say I've got a £150,000 mortgage, and I need to pay off this mortgage. I give a certain amount, let's say 8,000 a year I'm paying off, something along those lines. Yeah. So that's a debt I have to pay. So how does that work with my zakat? That's a debt. Can I use that against my the amount that I pay as zakat?
Contemporary ulama, when we talk about these type of debts, either lean towards reducing or deducting one lunar calendar's worth of debt, or 1 month's worth, or the upcoming month's worth of debt. I'm more inclined towards the 1 month's worth of debt rather than the lunar year, especially since people aren't really making any extra effort to clear their debts. Otherwise, it would be quite simple that you would have no assets, because you would be throwing all your assets at your debt, which is what really one should be doing anyway. But the fact that one is keeping assets in order to live a comfortable life, or whatever the rationale is behind it, and then using the debt as a means to avoid zakat, then that's something that should be avoided. So there's kind of ethical and issues as well that needs to be sort of explored.
Yeah, so and that's quite important. Again, ethics are very important. We give zakat because it's a form of ibadah. It's a worship, act of worship. You don't want to read half-baked salah, do you? So it's important to give zakat and give it fully with the right intention. Okay, right. Now, this is a good question. Dawar Abbas is asking this question. I'll put this to Mufti Zubair. I'm not sure. What should I do if I think my calculations in the previous years was inaccurate? I'm not sure whether it was accurate or it wasn't accurate. And now I'm having to sit down and try to work it out, but I can't work it out. What do I do in that kind of circumstance? Do I just take a guess?
Well, first of all, I would say it is important that you give your zakat accurately. And if you are unable to work it out yourself, then you should enlist the help of a competent alim who can help you navigate through, the whole working the calculation on how to do it. And if it becomes impossible to do so simply because, for example, you don't know the numbers anymore, then you would make a conservative guess with a small c, and just give it a little bit extra. And if you give extra, at least you are in credit and not having to sort of pay out of pocket afterwards.
And there are people who do this. I mean, we recognize the condition of giving zakat is that you have the intention that this is zakat. And the other condition is that you actually work it out. Now, from that perspective, I have come across people who when you ask them, did you work out your zakat? And the response to that is, well, I overestimate anyway, and I just give that amount. Is that acceptable? Is that acceptable just to overestimate?
It's acceptable if you don't, if you haven't underestimated. I mean, to work it out, the proper way is to work it out.
Yeah.
But is that an obligation? Well, not if you give him more.
Yeah.
The only reason required to work it out is to ensure that you give what is due. But if you are giving, people tend to give a bit more over what they need to, then that's fine. It's
valid. So Mufti Amjad, regarding gold, paying zakat on gold jewelry, do we have to calculate using the amount it can be sold at, i.e. scrapped gold price? Is that how it's worked out?
That's the price I think that's used. It's the market price that's used for gold. Once its value has been calculated, whether you're going through the Asian sort of tola style or by grams, and then it's calculated accordingly. So it's the market value of that gold that you've got the price for, and then you work out. With jewelry, according to the Ahnaf, obviously jewelry is included within zakat calculations because of its intrinsic value. Other madhahib can lean towards the view that because it's for personal use, and obviously certain items are excluded for personal use, like car, house, books, furniture, and all the rest of it, that can be as well. But because of its intrinsic value, it should be counted as part of zakat. And then obviously you've got to look at the makeup of the item, its quantity of gold or whatever, and calculate accordingly. But the key point, which even I'm now sort of drifting away from as we get into the kind of fiqh discussions, is the fact that this is an act of worship. And we've got to keep kind of reminding ourselves about that this is like fasting, this is like praying salah. So even though you're pretty sure your clothes are clean, but you've got a little bit of doubt, we wouldn't risk anything like that. So why risk it on something like that? I think because it's monetary and financial, we sort of deal with it differently than it would be if it was prayer or fasting.
I'm going to explore this thing about mortgages a bit more detailed, because I think people are asking this a lot and they do get a bit confused with this. So this is the thing about mortgages is that, how should I work it out? What kind of advice would you give me? So this is Mufti Zubair, in terms of how I give, how I work out my mortgage. Now, like I said, I've got so much amount that I'm giving out on a yearly basis. If I work it out on a monthly basis, this is the amount I'm taking out. Recognizing also that I'm paying an interest. So it's not just I'm paying a repayment, but I'm also paying an interest on that. So can I consider that interest amount that I'm paying as well? Can that be considered as zakatable? Not zakatable, but taken in essence in terms of my calculation as being a debt.
Okay. First of all, contrary to what Amjad has said, my opinion is that you take out one whole lunar year of zakatable, of one lunar year of payments. Okay, and the rationale for 1 month is not. I don't really understand that, because if you say 1 month, well, on the day, the question is on the day that you have to you calculate your zakat is liable. On that date, you have to give that 1 month payment or not. If not, then why include it? And if you are going to include it, the future payments, then for me, rather than induct the entire future payments and have a repeat every year, is 12 months that is deductible. Just stating my position on that first. Secondly,
it's not just a cumulative thing, you know, in terms of the fact that it adds up to a year's amount, monthly. They just work it. They just see it from a monthly perspective, but they don't actually. Is it not
for me, it's until the next zakat anniversary, what you have to give in between, you can deduct that.
They just divide it up into months.
Then if you have it depends on that. Then if you have first of all, conventional mortgage is not permissible. So if somebody has made the mistake of taking out conventional mortgage, if they're taken out an interest-only mortgage, where they're only paying the interest payments and the mortgage itself stays where it is, then that is not deductible.
Yeah.
So some interest is not deductible because that is invalidly applied. Okay. So if it's interest-only mortgage, nothing is deductible. If it's a mortgage where you are paying both capital and interest, then the capital that you are to pay over the next 12 months, not any interest, don't include any interest calculation, that only the capital that you are going to pay over the next 12 months, that can be deducted. If you have an Islamic mortgage, you have the murabaha mortgage, which tends not to apply now, but if you had the murabaha mortgage, then you can take off 12 months of installments. If you have an ijara or diminishing musharaka mortgage, then you can't take off anything because there's no debt.
Okay. Question regarding from Tonbridge Madrasa. I'm not sure what that is, but anyway, to what extent can a charity be considered from the amilin and utilize part of the zakat? We talked a bit about this before. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more, Mufti Amjad, on this a bit more in terms of the question that's been put here in terms of costs of distribution. Maybe give it in terms of advice to an organization, maybe, you know, that does this, because we get quite organizations that do ask this question, that we, you know, this is what we're doing. Can we use the zakat money for any element of the distribution itself, or does it have to solely be owned by the recipient? So it's tamlik again, you know, it has to be something that the recipient receives in their ownership, and, you know, nothing beyond that. What, maybe reiterate the advice there.
Yeah, so generally speaking, you know, amilin alayha doesn't apply to charities. I know there's some views that accept that it does, but, you know, let's take the kind of majority view that it doesn't apply because of the lack of authority that they possess in terms of claiming the money and then dealing with it. But obviously there is this big issue of how do charities then carry out the work. Now, you know, people will say, well, there's gift aid as an option, there's sadaqah as an option, there's other avenues which can be utilized to do that. And I guess they are the first point, and they're the first avenues that should be utilized. In some cases, some charities have used a tamlik hila through wakala. So there is that. And obviously that's a bit technical to kind of probably explore and explain here. In terms of how zakat funds can be utilized, it's an approach that has been utilized in Darul Ulooms and Islamic institutes in the India, Pakistan, places like that. So that's a possibility, but again, that's a bit more complicated, and it needs certain procedures in place in order for it to do that. So in short, it shouldn't be used, it can't be used. And instead, other avenues should be sought to look at the kind of continuous sort of running costs of the organization, or the ability to collect and share out, distribute the zakat.
There's a question from Alima. I'm going to make it a bit controversial. So she's asked a very simple question. We're going to make it a bit controversial. The simple question is, you know, can we give zakat to juniors? So, in other words, somebody who's not a balagh. And do they have to give zakat as well? And clearly, in terms of, we recognize that the zakat is based on the nisab, regardless of age. But I'm going to make it a bit controversial in the sense that when we introduce the idea of hila, okay, so hila is legal stratagems that are used, and let's talk about it, because it's something that people are talking about, and it's an important discussion out there. So this is a legal stratagem which some of the madhahib don't accept anyway, but according to the Hanafis, they can use it within conditions, strict conditions. So this is something that is sometimes talked about, for example, in madrasas. So you have madrasas and you have students. And what happens is we recognize that tamlik is important, so that they have to have ownership of that amount of money. So what they do is they receive zakat on the basis of them clearly having not achieved nisab and require of need of that money. And what happens is the system is organized in such a way that that student then pays that amount to the madrasa because it's now in their possession, it's their milkiyat, it's their ownership, and now they can give it in whatever cause. Mufti Zubair, I'm going to turn to you on the issue of hila. Is this something that is acceptable, and if it's acceptable, with what conditions?
Bismillahir-Rahmanir Okay.
You can talk around it if you don't want to give a direct answer. I can understand.
I am never one to dodge a question. You should know that by now. Okay.
That's why I asked you.
The madrasa, are you asking with regards to those madaris that where you have the people are boarding, etc., and the whole responsibility to feed, etc., they provide free education, free accommodation, etc., and the responsibility is on the madrasa, or are you talking about those madaris that are fee paying?
Okay, so let's deal with both then. So there's one instance where they provide for those students, okay, in terms of their needs, yeah, so food and the bedding and stuff. There's others that don't.
Typically in the Indian subcontinent, the madaris are provide food, lodging, etc., or everything for the student. And effectively, the student turns up, pitches up with his bag and said, okay, here, look after me, right? Now, traditionally there has been a discussion as to whether such madaris or the management of such madaris qualify as amilin.
Okay.
And earlier as Mufti Kifayatullah, the Grand Mufti of Hindustan, India, he said yes, they are essentially amilin, because they have the whole responsibility for that individual to look after that individual. Others disagreed and said, actually, no, they are at best, they are agents of the zakat payers. And so a via media between that was what happens in some madaris is that every year the child enrolls into the madrasa and authorizes the madrasa to collect zakat on its behalf and distribute it according to the policies of the madrasa. And this is the wakala model, which you have referred to as a...
I'll just explain. Wakala model is basically where the recipient assigns that duty to an individual.
Yeah, it just makes the organization an agent to receive zakat on its behalf and utilize accordingly. Okay, so that is one way of doing things. Another way of some madrasa, what they do is when zakat funds come into the madrasa, they will give it to a poor student and say, okay, you know what, and sit down with the poor student who is Balagh and say, okay, these funds are coming to the madrasa, and we're going to give you this money and you are free to do what you want, but you know what, if you were to give it to the madrasa, it would be very, very nice, right? And constructively, that individual has no choice. And if that child was to say, that student was to say, okay, thank you very much, and see you later, they wouldn't get a good reception.
They wouldn't get very good results in their exam.
They wouldn't be, they wouldn't be the most sort of welcome person in the madrasa. Let's put it that way. And so therefore, effectively, they have no choice. For me, that is problematic. If there is no choice, then that structure.
There's an element of coercion. If there's an element of coercion,
yeah. But and the coercion can be physical. It can be sort of a reputation, etc. For me, that doesn't work.
It can be emotive, can't it? Emotional as well.
However, having said that, madrasas that provide food and lodging, etc., they have to run as well. And you can't expect the madrasa to provide everything for free, and then you also don't do anything. And so for me, every year where they enroll and authorize the madrasa is the model to use. For me, that's not a hila. For me, that's not a hila. It's just making the madrasa an agent. And hila is kind of sometimes used as a dirty word, when it's not always a dirty word. Hila can be valid hila, and hila can be an invalid. It can be you escaping the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't become valid. One of the examples of that would be, for example, when it's coming your anniversary with zakat, you gift all your money to your wife. And then when the zakat anniversary passes, you say, okay, the wife gives it back. There won't be any zakat upon you, but it is makruh tahrimi, and it is hila.
It has to fall within the spirit of Islam, in other words, doesn't it?
On the other hand, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has taught Sahaba hila himself. When they used to sell jama dates for janib dates, and they used to sell 1 sa' for 2 sa', Rasulullah said, don't do that, because when you start exchanging dates for dates, it has to be equal. exchange these dates for dirhams and then with the dirhams buy the other dates. So he actually taught the healer himself. So the stratagems to avoid the impermissible when the intention is correct is actually a valid position to take.
I think, Mufti Amjad, I'm going to pick about 3-4 questions and put them all, sum them together, because I know the answer is just one, and it's to do with tamleek. Can you just elaborate on this tamleek? Because people get really confused about it, and they keep asking questions related to it in an indirect way. So there's something about, can I not just give my zakat to an organization? Can I not just give my zakat to a group of people, who represent an organization, and in terms of who's eligible for zakat? Could you just elaborate on this idea of tamleek in terms of ownership, that the person who receives has to own the money and then?
Yeah, in short, that's what it is. The person who is the recipient of zakat has to become the owner of zakat. However, sometimes what people do get confused about is, again, what we've just talked about, say an orphanage or a madrasa or something like that, where there are other individuals who act on behalf of somebody. So they may think, oh, well, I'm actually giving it to an institute because I'm giving it to Institute X. Well, that Institute X is representing, so, it might be, I don't know, a drug rehabilitation center in the middle of Pakistan, for example. And that drug rehabilitation center is collecting zakat on behalf of these individuals who are going through rehabilitation. Now, it might be that you actually give the zakat to whatever it's called, We Fix, people who are on drugs. That's the organization. But what they're not seeing is that there's an agreement between the recipient of the zakat, the real recipient of the zakat, and the organization. So what they need to do is obviously just ensure that there's something in place, there's sufficient information that there is a person who's becoming an owner of this wealth. And even if that person may not necessarily get that wealth sort of straight away, a lot of charities do work, for example, where people may need certain things. And what that's done is that they make purchases for that person and then get that material to those. So there's lots of mechanisms by which a person can deputize somebody, or that person themselves is a recipient. So sometimes, even though it looks like an institute, it could be that that institute is acting as a deputy on behalf of the recipients. But the key bottom line of all of this is, you can't give it to, say, a well for the sake of a well, or you can't give it to a dead person. You can't give it to things like that. But you may even be able to give it to a masjid if, for example, it houses poor people in its basement or something like that. So you've got to look at how the mechanisms exist for where you're giving your zakat to.
So hopefully that answers this question about giving zakat to the debts of a charity. So clearly, no, you can't pay off zakat for the debt of a charity. Now, there's another question regarding tax gift money, which is an extra money added to the zakat. I'm assuming that is gift aid, so that's optional anyway. So I don't see the issue here. Let's move on. Recently, now we'll give us right. Okay, so we've got something right. We're getting really long questions. I'm trying to avoid long questions because of the time. Okay, someone is buying a house between the acceptance of the offer and the final. Oh, this is a technical question, right? Someone is buying a house between the acceptance of the offer. This is Asman. Asman, you can come online. Go and ask the question. We'll give you the chance to come online and ask the question directly, because you've got 2 questions here. Hopefully you're there. Is Mufti Asmar? If not, then we'll move on. So we've got Tonbridge Madrasa said people have really large pension pots. What if they don't have the funds available to make the zakat payments? Mufti Zubair?
This Bismillah ar-Rahim, this is an issue that does come up. But I would look at it this way: if you have a very large pension pot, you're doing quite well. And and then it won't be the entire pension pot that is zakatable. It will be a certain amount. Generally, if the investments are probably around about 40% would be safe, maybe even down to 25%. That is calculation that would need to be made. Then it is not necessary to pay the pension up front, or they pay the zakat on the pension up front, or they can delay it until they receive it. However, when they do receive it, it probably will amount to a large amount. But for me, it would be a case of, if a pension pot is worth that much, then you're doing quite well, no?
Okay, right. Now we're running out of time, so I'm going to allow the last 5 minutes. I'm going to let people come on online and ask their questions. So let's make them good questions. So we've got Ahmed. We're going to allow you to talk. If you raise your hand, we will allow you on, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Dr. Rafaqat, good to see you again. Hope you're well. Mufti Zubair, you've touched on the pension one. I asked it in the Q&A, but this is something which has been bothering me for several years, actually. So I'm glad that this conversation is taking place. So I'm still working age. I don't have a pension to draw upon. If I draw upon my pension, then that means I'm cancelling my pension plan, which means it's taxable. Now, there is this element, isn't there, where even if you have money within a pension plan, you need to actually take zakat out of it. Now, you know, how is this workable? Because, you know, you don't have the money.
What type of pension is it?
So at the moment, I've invested all of it in a Sharia compliant one.
Okay.
So it's one which has been bothered. I'm really glad that I came to ask this question now. Because just to add on, sorry, because I have asked some people locally. We've got a Mufti Hanif who does some seminars, lectures during the month of Ramadan, particularly around this, and is a bit of a big area which he couldn't really answer. He did request that I speak to Mufti.
Do you know how the pension is invested?
Sorry.
Do you know how the pension is invested? Given a Sharia compliant, I imagine it's probably in property.
It's well, it's the HSBC Amana one.
Do you know what's invested in?
Oh, it's a number of categories, isn't it? It's percentaged out amongst other sectors. I'll have to check.
Yeah, I think you might find that because generally pension probably be invested in property or something, and generally that won't be zakatable. The property itself won't be zakatable. Any cash that's in there, any receivables in there, that will be zakatable. But or anything they buy to sell on will be zakatable. But generally, majority of that I imagine will not be zakatable. You have to look into the exact nature of that pension. Effectively, this type of pension is a long-term investment, and investments are zakatable depending on how they're invested. So that you'll have to determine first.
It's just that HSBC is in stocks of large companies. That's how they invest.
There's two, because my current my previous one is a HSBC Amana, and I think the current one with another provider is another HSBC one. Now, this is the thing where the technicalities of breaking this down is something which is way over my head. Obviously, I'm not a learned person. Who's the best person to speak to with regards to this in terms of sitting down? Now, here is let's just say if they say, okay, oh, Ahmed, you know, your zakat from when you started.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you there, because it looks like you probably need to take maybe Mufti Zubair's number and talk to him directly.
Yes.
I'm just going to give the last moment. I know Mufti Amjad needs to go, so inshallah we'll give Mufti Amjad permission. Jazakallah khair, Mufti Sahib, for coming on, and it's been really always a pleasure to have you on. So inshallah we'll see a lot more of you inshallah in the near future. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. We got Mufti Asmar who's asking a question as well. So we'll just allow the last one, and then inshallah we'll have to close it. So Mufti Asmar.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, just to repeat that question earlier. By the way, just if I can add a comment, Mufti Faraz Adam, he's got a proxy that he uses for Sharia compliant funds. Mufti Zubair will probably aware of it. 26%. I don't know if that assists the last person that was asking. I just thought I'd share that. My question is very simple. You're buying a house. You've agreed a price, £200,000. And between you finalizing the deal, your zakat date appears. So that 200 grand that's in your bank account, do you pay zakat on it? And if you don't pay zakat on it and the deal happens to break down, what happens when the money, what happens? Do you go back and pay zakat on it, or are you let off the hook?
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. From your question, it would appear that you currently haven't incurred a debt. You are in the process of buying the property. That's why if it breaks down, and then you don't end up buying it. So the property hasn't become yours, you haven't incurred a debt yet. So until the offer and acceptance isn't complete, the money that's been set aside for buying the property is zakatable.
Some Mufti and Ikram say that the Islamic acceptance and offer, ijab and qabul, takes place when you've made the offer, and the lawyers are just simply completing the shariat, and they're just completing the conditions of the sale, and they say that there's no zakat on that. What would you say to that?
I would say to them, okay, do the parties have the right to withdraw from the agreement?
Yeah, they've got the right, but it's not seen to be a good thing, you know, when you back out a deal for absolutely no reason.
They have the right. So that means Islamically, even Islamically, it's not. Yes, they have said ijab and qabul, but that ijab and qabul is not transfer of ownership. It is not transfer of ownership, and they're working in the legal framework of the UK, and they're accepting that legal framework of the UK, and that would mean that until they don't have, otherwise, if you say it's a transfer of ownership, or say, give me my house, then I can hand over the house, and the other person will deny it. So no, even though the ijab and qabul on Islamic level has happened, meaning they've offered that actually is not the ijab and qabul, it's actually the exchange of contracts.
No problem. Jazakallah.
Okay, inshallah. Right, so we're going to have to finish there, and I want to thank Mufti Zubair as always, you know, volunteering to come on and you know, support us in our webinars, inshallah. And like I said, Mufti Sahib has his own website as part of Al-Qalam, so do go there and for references in terms of, you know, discussions, more contemporary discussions about insurances and pensions and various other things related to zakat as well. So inshallah, Jazakallah Mufti Sahib, and I want to thank you again for appearing in and being under the scrutiny of the hot seat, especially with that kind of scene in the background. I'm sure you know, receiving some of that heat there as well. So we'll just before I finish, this is recorded, so inshallah you can receive this if you've registered on this webinar. So you can receive a link to the video, inshallah, and it'll be on YouTube as well. So please do, you know, spread the word, inshallah, in terms of the contents of this. It's valuable discussion, of the number of discussions we've had today. And like I mentioned right from the beginning, I know some of you weren't here in the beginning, you know, we weren't here to discuss basic issues regarding zakat. This is to talk about some of the contemporary discussions in terms of how we employ some of those conditions of zakat in today's society, where we have also some wonderful challenges. So if you want some of the basic understandings of zakat and you want to ask more personalized questions, then I highly recommend that you continue on our zakat courses. We've got about 6 of them that have been going throughout the whole of Ramadan. You can still join if you need to, and inshallah you'll get the opportunity to talk to our instructors and also go through some of the most standard basics regarding zakat. So Jazakumullah khair for joining us, and inshallah we will have another webinar next weekend. Please join us for that one. This webinar is quite an important webinar because this webinar is mainly focused on some of the things that have been happening during the COVID-19 pandemic, and recognizing how many loved ones we have lost. So it's in reference to that, and it's also as a means of bringing back some of the you know, the important messages that we need to take on board in such a challenging time, inshallah. So please do join us in our next weekend webinar, as on all the webinars that we have on Al-Balagh Academy. And Jazakallah for taking out your time. Hopefully it's been of benefit to you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.